Well, welcome to everybody to the webinar on drivers and barriers of regulatory change processes in digital financial services. My name is Barbara Scola and I will be the moderator of today's webinar. I am calling in from France, where I work as a consultant for CGAP. And I'm happy that a lot of people signed up for the webinar today. I think we had over 120 people registered, and many of you have already dialed in, so thank you for that. As it says in the title, this webinar is meant for funders in particular, and our discussion will focus on how funders can gain a better understanding of regulatory reform processes and facilitate change. By funders, I am referring here to all types of development agencies or private foundations who support financial inclusion and digital financial services in particular. Before we start, let me go over a few technical details. This is an audio broadcast. Your microphones will remain muted during the entire webinar, unless you're a speaker, of course. To ask questions anytime, please use the chat box on the right-hand side of the WebEx interface. We will select a few questions for discussion at the end. To make sure we see your question, select All Participants from the drop-down menu. The webinar will be recorded and the recording will be emailed to all participants afterwards. I am happy to introduce you to our speakers, who will bring three different perspectives on regulatory reform processes in digital financial services. My colleague Patrick Mayer, who is calling in from Washington, works with CGAP on the regulatory dimensions of financial inclusion, particularly in digital financial services. Patrick has worked in nearly all regions of the world and has extensive experience advising regulators and policymakers. Ahmed, calling in from Brussels, I believe, is a policy and digital ecosystem specialist at UNCDF, where he leads the Policy Accelerator project. In a previous life, Ahmed was a bank supervisor himself and also a policy advisor at the UK's Financial Conduct Authority. Brian Muthiora, calling in from Nairobi, is the regulatory director for GSMA's Mobile Money program. He provides support to mobile operators in Africa and the Middle East, and he also delivers key messages from the industry to regulators in those regions. I would also like to introduce you to my colleagues in Washington, Sylvia, Anna, and Jake, who worked with me to prepare this webinar and provide support today. After the introduction, Patrick will talk about the barriers to digital financial services regulatory reforms and propose a framework for integrating a political economy perspective in regulatory diagnostics. We will then hear from Ahmed about UNCDF's experience working with regulators and how UNCDF goes about identifying drivers and barriers of change. In the following discussion, Brian will share GSMA's perspective on what drives or blocks change and what industry associations and funders can do about it. We will continue the discussion with Patrick and Ahmed. For the Q&A, please post your questions using the chat box anytime during the webinar. To manage expectations, let me just clarify that this webinar is not about what the regulatory enablers for digital financial services are. Those are pictured on this slide on the right-hand side. If you would like to know more about those regulatory enablers, I invite you to read the publication that is indicated at the bottom of this slide. Our focus today is how to facilitate reform processes that lead to those regulatory enablers. In short, it's not about what kind of changes need to happen, but how we can facilitate regulatory change processes that lead to more enabling environments. The idea for this webinar came up as we were looking into how funders help improve the regulatory environments for inclusive digital financial services. We found that funders support partner countries in multiple ways, for example, by providing technical assistance to draft new regulations, also through research and advisory for regulators, or by financing the implementation of reforms through policy-based lending. And I'm sure there are many more other instruments. But support for regulatory reforms often seems to fall short of expected outcomes. So why is that? One key question to ask is whether solutions match the problems that need to be addressed. And even more importantly, whether we actually target the right problems. Funders' interventions are usually informed by regulatory diagnostics, which give an overview of the regulatory landscape in a country and identify bottlenecks for the development of digital financial services. However, we found that those diagnostics and many diagnostic tools focus mainly on technical aspects and don't sufficiently take into account who drives and who blocks regulatory change and why. But that is often exactly where things get stuck. The focus of this webinar is to discuss how regulatory diagnostics can better capture the power dynamics that influence regulatory reform in digital financial services. The idea is that a better diagnosis of the problems might lead to more effective solutions. Let me now hand over to Patrick, who helps us unpack what we mean by diagnostics, and he will use specific examples from digital financial services. Let me pass you the ball. Over to you, Patrick.
Thank you, Barbara. So our dilemma here is that there may be a technically sound reform that does not have the expected impact. And so to think about that, if I can advance the slide, first, it's a matter of identifying the problem. So maybe it's poor outcomes under existing policy, maybe it's the failure to enact or implement reform, or simply a lack of impact of a new reform. The second step, diagnosis, is what we're focusing on today. Why do we have this outcome? And there are a couple of factors, types of factors, structural and behavioral, that I'll get into as we proceed. The next step would be to use the same metaphor, prescription or a way forward. What actions should we take? Is there a plausible pathway of change? What are the change processes that are implied? Can you work with the grain? Can you take steps to avoid or overcome the barriers? So in the diagnostic, we look at two different kinds of factors, as I mentioned, structural and behavioral. So the structural are more systemic, entrenched factors that might include an outdated framework of law and regulation, deficits or shortfalls in capacity, often in the regulator, but not necessarily exclusively, problems of legacy infrastructure and legacy institutions. So we're talking about the banking sector, the established payment systems, the actual bricks and mortar banks, the digital backbone of the country. What's the status of that? Then interacting with that are the behavioral factors, power relations. So that might be political coalitions or social networks, economic interests, favored sectors, monopolies, lobbies for particular sectors or industries, political dynamics, so changes in power holding, elections, or some kind of party competition or a shifting political base, and incentives. So this is more at the micro level, where you may have policies that create a strong interest in particular behavior that doesn't match the policy expectation. That might be considered distortions. For example, excessive risk-taking or too little risk-taking, and so a focus on wealthy clients by the banking sector, for example. So if we apply this to the digital financial services context, we see that the structural factors might include regulators lacking clear authority for new entities or products. So if you think of fintechs rising up and starting to offer services, does that fall within the regulatory authority of one regulator or another? Established legal and regulatory frameworks can complicate reform so that, for example, there may be banking, telecom, and consumer regulatory frameworks that are not really consistent with each other and that may mutually block progress. The legislative and regulatory processes might be uncoordinated or somehow compromised. And so policies moving in different directions and maybe responding to more narrow interests. Then at the intersection, moving to the right, of structural and behavioral, we have things like international pressure, the foreign investors, the donors, the Financial Action Task Force that may be asserting pressure on the domestic sphere. Then at the top, and going around to the right, we have the four main interest groups that we're concerned about in this sector. So we have regulators who maybe have a tendency to be conservative or risk averse, which can be a good thing, but you can have too much of a good thing. Then there are the entrenched banking sectors that tend to steer reform processes in their own interests or to block reform, and they have a particular in with the central banks, of course. Then you have the new market entrants that have less of a voice, and so they might be mobile money providers or fintechs or platforms. And then you have the poor and unbanked, who we're most concerned about and who may lack strong advocates, but may also be ready to take to the barriers and protest if they see abuses happening across the board, sharp practices by lenders, for example. And so if we think about reform, we can divide it into three phases. So there's the developing and adopting the reform, there's implementation by the regulator, and there's uptake or impact on the market, both on the supply side and the demand side. So if we go to some examples at each step in this process, so at the formulation and adoption stage, we could take the example of restrictions that are written into the new rules, restricting non-bank provision. So I've given a couple of examples there. If we take India, not to pick on India, but India can take care of itself, I'm sure. There's a powerful banking sector, about 70% state-owned, and the state-owned banks are sometimes a political tool. And so, they have a key role in social transfer distribution. And so when reforms come along, they tend to be enacted in a way that suits the banking system, so that the new framework that came up a couple of years ago was payment banks, right? So a kind of DFS provider that's within the banking sector. Now, as it turns out, the banks have done even better than expected, and so they are almost making the payments banks irrelevant. And so this gives you a sense of what happens with the banking sector at this stage. At the next stage, implementation by the regulator, you've got the possibility of a lack of coordination across regulators. This is the multiple regulator scenario. So the Ugandan example is one where regulators in different sectors may come into conflict. So the telecom regulator at one point, for security reasons, tightened the identity regulations on SIM cards. And so that, in effect, changed the onboarding and customer due diligence processes for customers of mobile money providers. And so there you have a direct impact on what the regulatory framework for digital services is. Thirdly, at the market impact stage, we have an example of pardon me, example of dominant or major providers, withholding or overpricing interoperability or interconnection. So, for example, a big provider like Safaricom not providing its USSD channel to competing providers. You have a major telecom company that is also a participant, a competitor in the mobile money market, and is at the same time a provider of the rails or the digital pathways, conduits. And so in both Kenya and in West Africa, it required intervention by the telecom regulator to open that channel up, and there were eventually agreements on interoperability. So those are just a couple of quick examples that raise the question about political economy, which is the kind of analysis that deals with political and economic processes and their impact on the distribution of power and wealth. Now, there's not a lot of political economy literature on digital financial services. It usually deals with things like, retirement reforms in France, for example, where we see people taking to the streets. So in the general sense, to come to understand how the political economic factors affect what's going on in the sector, we have to ask a series of questions. So who are the stakeholders? What are their roles, responsibilities? Who must act? And again, we come to the four groups, the banks, the regulators, the new entrants, and the customers. How do those different interests conflict with each other? What are the possible coalitions among members of that group of four? The next two questions are about whose interests count. What's the ownership structure like? Big banks, small banks, state-owned or not, and the power relations. The next two, regulatory capture and decision-making, are about decision-making processes and what influences them. So for decision-making, is there an administrative procedure that's laid out so that decisions are transparent and participatory? Can stakeholders comment? Is it a real process, or is it dominated by a few powerful groups? Regulatory capture is the endpoint of this, where the powerful groups essentially are able to dictate policy. The last point, implementation, has to do with whether the rules are enforced, whether that's done fairly, and what the constraints are on that. So to move from diagnosis to prescription, or the way forward, it helps to think in terms of what the drivers of reform are. They might be macro pressures, they might be a crisis, a political change, competitive pressure within the sector, a pent-up demand, or some call or pressure to greatly increase financial inclusion, which happens at times. So then the question becomes, who are the winners and losers? And within those groups, who are the champions and what you might call the anti-champions? Again, we revert to our four groups, and we think about, okay, how do they interact? What coalitions might there be? Next, what might the reform strategy be? A second best reform, a gradual pathway to reform. Sometimes the reform needs to compromise more with the powerful banking interests, for example, or there might be a gradualist approach, such as setting up a regulatory sandbox to test new approaches. So what reforms are likely to be effective, and what are the constraints? Again, we come to enforcement and market uptake. So in summary, the role of this kind of political economy analysis is not to be a silver bullet. It doesn't give you the specific policy answer to everything, right? It helps sharpen the diagnosis and the advice to steer away from obstacles that can be avoided or overcome. It helps to define entry points, timing, and sequence. So this might be a question of, taking, grabbing the low-hanging fruit first and having some quick wins, so-called, that build momentum. So the caveats are that this can take time, this kind of analysis. And as we say, garbage in, garbage out. You need accurate, meaningful analysis in order for this kind of perspective to have any real utility. So it's less about policy proposals or specific solutions than about the potential barriers and strategies for overcoming them. And I can talk more about this as we move on. And I've given some examples here at the end that we can take up later, or perhaps you can look at your leisure. And so now I will pass to Ahmed.
Thank you,
Great.
Patrick. And just to remind people that you can ask questions anytime through the chat box, and we will address those questions at the end of the webinar. Over to you, Ahmed.
Great. Thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Fantastic. Thanks, Patrick, for that intro and setting the scene so well. What I'm going to do now is kind of dive down a little bit more granularly into the mechanics of how UNCDF applies its resources to try and tackle specific policy reforms that acknowledge both the technical issues, the problems that we need to solve, but as well as those behavioral and structural components that Patrick described so well. The first thing to perhaps talk about is, what is the environment we're working in, and how can we communicate or explain the sentiment that we feel in the field where UNCDF works with regulators in 20+ markets between Africa, South Asia, East Asia, and the Pacific. And so this slide, I think, sums it up pretty well. For a long time in the financial inclusion context, we were focused on banks and whether they were doing their jobs. And now mobile operators are coming to eat their lunch. And, the scenario where, as in India, for example, Patrick noted how the banks were able to recover and take some of that market back that was assumed from payment banks. But then we have a much bigger fish now. And the Google, Facebooks, WeChat, Alipays are simply examples of super platforms of which a lot has been written that are now moving into the financial space, the financial sector space, with significant volumes and uptake. So this new generation of actors is really occupying a lot of mind space in terms of the regulatory focus and concern, and it is having an effect on the political economy. I also want to highlight here that it's not that the super platforms have overtaken the concern around mobile operators and banks. Those concerns still remain. So what we've done is we've added bigger and more complex actors, and we haven't really addressed the issues of the smaller, less complex actors. So from UNCDF's perspective, where do we start when we address this? Our engagement is much deeper than technical assistance. So usually we think about, do we have the expertise to advise on e-money reforms, or should agents be exclusive? How low should your tiered KYC thresholds be, et cetera? But really, to make progress on policy reforms and to get the right answer to manifest itself in law or regulation requires a lot more work. And here you see that we've kind of paralleled a little bit of the context that Patrick presented before in terms of looking for sort of more structural and behavioral elements to our work. So if you look in terms of the iceberg, at the bottom of it, we've got the systems architecture. So in order to deliver our technical assistance, we have to manage our knowledge well, leverage the writing that CGAP produces, the other World Bank, the Alliance for Financial Inclusion. So how are we bringing all that information to bear? When we work across multiple markets, having a law library where we can refer to precedent is extraordinarily useful. Clearly measuring results, templates, these things make sure that we can be high quality and consistent in our delivery of assistance and support to regulators. However, bringing those systems, those mechanical components to bear in a useful fashion requires a much more nuanced engagement approach. And this is where the behavioral aspect comes in, building rapport with our counterparts, understanding their needs, being diplomatic, taking the time to build trust, presence, leveraging peers to provide support. And in the engagement approach, at least in terms of being a UN agency, our neutrality and convening power is extraordinarily helpful in terms of how we can really adapt our means to be as engaging as possible for regulators. But having a pretty slide with the iceberg isn't sufficient. We do need a method to our madness. And so we focus on clear outcomes which collectively contribute to change through this theory of change that we have, where our sector outcome, what we're really trying to do with our policy and regulatory work is improve policies in the enabling environment for DFS. When we reverse engineer that and think to ourselves, what are the three things that are really, we believe we can affect that contributes to that improved environment? There's three particular categories. One is, are we helping the right advice, expert advice to guide policy development? Are we improving the capacity to supervise DFS? And are we helping to increase the commitment to the DFS agenda more broadly? Looking at those three elements, we kind of organized our work across 4 different buckets where we actually can organize our activities. These are, as I mentioned, the expert-guided policy development, data-driven decision-making, public-private dialogue, and exposure to global practice. And between those 4, we can program activities. So the policy advice, or the expert-guided advice, we can do diagnostics, we can meet regulators in person, we can provide examples of precedent and review their regulations and suggest new language, for example. The data-driven decision-making is exactly what it says on the tin, where we look at market data that they may have collected themselves in terms of compliance data. Findex is extraordinarily helpful as a global database to really understand which segments do they want to affect. For example, are they looking for more uptake from women? Are we looking for more usage of accounts, or is the focus on access? How many accounts do they currently have? Really making sure we're specifying the impact that we want to drive. Public-private dialogue, this is a critical one that we focus a lot of our effort on because our work doesn't focus on changing regulations for regulatory sake, but rather to address a market barrier. So our understanding of the market puts us in a position to broker the regulatory public policy objectives against the private sector needs and opportunities. A refrain we often use is that if regulators are drawing the map, it's the private sector who have the responsibility to climb the mountain, and they take the risks in doing so. Really making sure that we focus on increasing collaboration between public and private sector is important, and using data to do that is an effective way to bring people to the table around a common vision. How many people do we need to affect, and by when? And the last bucket of our activities and outputs is exposure to global practice, where we try and learn from other markets like India, Nigeria, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Pacific, Philippines, Pakistan. Many of the early movers in this space, Mexico, have demonstrated tons of lessons, plus new actors who are really doing amazing things. If we look at Nepal with the RegTech solutions, Rwanda with a really comprehensive approach, et cetera. So collectively, this theory of change, we feel, can take us to an environment where we're improving regulation and policy for DFS. So when we actually do our regulatory assessments and our TAs, we try to organize ourselves around an organized process and methodology. And what you see here are 5 broad areas, which I'll go through very quickly, which contribute to a way of presenting our position and our findings to the regulator to really start a conversation. And that's something I'd really like to emphasize, is that when we do diagnostic work to determine what is needed from the regulatory environment to enable DFS, the diagnosis is simply the beginning of the process. It is not an end in itself. And we've really put a lot of time into thinking about how can it create buy-in and define a process that the regulators themselves define. We're simply there to help facilitate the process. So the first thing we do is identify stakeholders within and outside the government who have some influence or impact on the issue we're trying to address, whether it's changing e-money rules or payment system licensing or KYC or agents. You know, it goes without saying that we review the relevant laws and policies to determine what the existing context is. And we often talk about enablers and inhibitors, and we see as enablers are macroeconomic policies around economic development, segment focus, where we see positive attributes in the regulatory environment. Those are very helpful to make a compelling case to move on reforms where they're needed. So rather than coming in with a negative voice saying you don't have this, we often start by saying you have these existing precedents which are really positive. Let's make sure we can move the needle and create reforms that match that existing positive outcome that you've already highlighted. Those are our policy anchors, which more or less align to the national priorities. And then from there, we develop a set of lines of inquiry to understand the market context. And in the next slide, when we get there, I'll specify exactly what that is, but we try and create a short list of questions. We can't ask a million questions when we're going around trying to talk to as many providers and regulators as possible. When you only have an hour, what are the most important things that you need to get to? And how do those change based on who you're talking to? And then from all of that, we're in a great position to start to draw international comparisons. It's useful, desk-based, in advance of a visit or an engagement to think about potential comparison, but the real comparisons reveal themselves after you've understood the market more deeply. And so rather than focusing on conclusions or recommendations and to present this emotion of sort of finality at the end of our work, we really try and develop a relationship and a conversation with regulators where the conversation is around findings and options. And the findings are really objective. This is what we've heard. Do you agree with that? We believe that there are this many actors, that there's this gap. We're really trying not to do anything other than help the regulators get a second opinion on what is happening in their market. And from this, we're in a good position to reveal various scenarios that might emerge from different regulatory approaches. And so the discussion is really around, based on your existing context in this market, given the existing variables, so you have this many players, these types of business models, this number of customers, and these public objectives, here are the various options that you seem to have. For example, you could go a sandbox sort of test and learn approach. You could do nothing. Oftentimes, one of the options we provide is, just leave it as is and let it evolve. And then we have, usually the option, which is to say, if you had to be very deliberate about accelerating market change, this option or that one might do it. And by having an open conversation about the viability of those options, the solution often is adopted by the user themselves, which is in this case policymakers and regulators. We feel our, as in the UNCDF's neutral position, is one that gives us the flexibility to be more open in the options available. We do have a position. We do think agents should be non-exclusive. We do believe interoperability is important. KYC should be tiered. This doesn't mean that we don't have a position on many issues, but we do believe that there are many ways to get to the same outcome, and that path should be chosen by the regulators themselves. And we're there to help them through that process. So rather than being abstract, I have an example here from some work we've recently done in Sierra Leone, which gets a little bit into the details. And this is an ongoing process. So we might find, frankly, I might revisit the slide in 6 months and realize that we might have been wrong. But in the spirit of full transparency, you can see here our diagnostic model really follows these 3 broad categories. What are our lines of inquiry? What's happening in the market? What are the policy options, the possible courses of action that reveal themselves from that inquiry? And then what does that tell us about what we ought to be doing next to accelerate the reform process? And so in the case of consumer protection, we've got these 5 relatively straightforward questions, but when you start digging deep into them in an interview context with providers, banks, mobile operators, MFIs, and regulators, you get a lot of different answers. How complete and consistent is the regulatory framework? How are different business models managing the impact on consumer protection? Do we have a common definition of fairness? What does that mean to you as a bank versus you as a mobile operator? How is important information shared with the customer? What are common customer complaints and how are they managed? These are relatively open. Notice that these are literally all open questions. These are not yes or no binary. The idea is to engage in a dialogue and understand what the prevailing models are, what the prevailing sentiment is, so we really understand that market as deeply as possible. This process could take a week. It could be multiple visits. It's not necessarily a cookie cutter approach in terms of doing this and completing the inquiry. The policy options that emerge from this sort of inquiry are, in the case of Sierra Leone, was really focused on harmonization. So we saw different regulations applied differently to different providers around consumer protection. So the agent regulation said something about consumer protection, e-money equally. And we felt that one of the key issues to highlight were how are you going to go about harmonizing this? And there were various ways to do so. One of them was around agreeing definitions and examples, right? For transparency, fairness, et cetera, standardizing compliance data, et cetera. I just want to highlight here, in this case, we've discovered something that is somewhat consistent in many of the discussions we have around the case for change for policy reform is not simply about getting the regulation to say the right thing. It often accompanies structural change and organizational change. And that's a complex situation when you might have new departments emerging, new leadership, et cetera. And in this case, centralizing the complaints function kind of meant revisiting how the organization works. And we have to choose, and this is where we work with the regulator to help them understand that this is what we see, and then talk to them about possible solutions. And lastly, in terms of next steps, invariably, we organize a debrief so we can walk through the report and the findings in detail. We develop a learning agenda, in this case on consumer protection, to say what areas do you need to know more about so you're comfortable completing the process of facilitating reforms. Then, there's the review of the consumer protection draft itself. And almost invariably in every single one of these, in some form, in the next steps, there's an industry consultation on the draft, depending on how soon we can do that. And then we finalize and issue the guidelines. So this is a very specific case that provides a relatively good example of how we consistently apply this process. This whole thing took us about 2 months from beginning to end. It could take longer in a more complex market, like say Ethiopia, or quicker in a smaller, less dynamic market like the Gambia, where we recently have done work in both of those countries. So this approach expands and contracts depending on the market context and the range of issues themselves. So let me stop there. I appreciate your patience and I look forward to your questions. Let me pass the ball back to you, Barbara.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. That really makes, shows us how you're working and thinking about these issues. We'll get back to you with questions, but first I would really like to hear from Brian Muthiora from the GSMA to also get the industry's perspective on regulatory change. So Brian, from GSMA's perspective as an industry association, what are some of the key barriers to reform in digital financial services that we haven't already mentioned today? And how come that regulators and industry players sometimes struggle to address those issues?
Thank you very much, Barbara, for this opportunity. I think from an industry perspective, the barriers that we see are somewhat varied. One, I would say, is what I'd call the substantive barrier, which is the authorization regimes we see in various countries. So some authorization regimes, of course, make it very difficult for non-bank actors to participate in the delivery of digital financial services, either being too restrictive or placing very high compliance costs on the non-bank actors or those willing to enter the space. Another barrier we see is, I'll call it infrastructural, in the sense of either having underdeveloped or poorly developed infrastructure. So for instance, underdeveloped national identity infrastructure, which then makes it very difficult to perform eKYC or ID verification services, or even just having no national ID being issued over several years, which then denies access to financial services to a great number of people. Another example would also be poorly developed payments switching infrastructure. We're seeing a lot of interoperability projects in many countries which are centered around switches. But some of this infrastructure, the existing infrastructure, may not be suitable for scale or for the processing of high volume retail transactions, and that of course creates the potential for slowing down of the growth of digital financial services. I think lastly would be to speak about the capacity of some of the regulators in dealing with this emerging digital financial services or even business models. I think capacity is a big issue that should be dealt with to allow regulators to be able to properly appreciate the power of digital financial services, and also just to see themselves as facilitators of the growth of this industry, not rather than acting as gatekeepers or hostile gatekeepers. I think they should see themselves as facilitators. To the second part of your question, sorry if you can just repeat it.
Yes, the question would be, so when those barriers come apparent in a market, why do regulators and industry players struggle to find solutions to those constraints? And maybe what's specific about digital financial services as an industry? Right.
I think if there are any difficulties in trying to find solutions to these problems, it's in my view, I think it would be because you're dealing with two sides that are not natural. This is not a natural relationship between digital platform providers or digital financial services providers like mobile operators and central banks, and that then creates possibly some mistrust. You have mistrust between the providers of the service and the regulators, misunderstanding. It's just not a natural occurring relationship, and that then creates a lot of friction between the two, which could actually be a huge a barrier in terms of trying to resolve these issues. Sorry, I was just going to say that the role we play as a GSMA when we see this kind of friction occurring is we use our convening power within the industry to try and bring the operators together with the public sector, with the regulators, by providing platforms for dialogue. And in the few instances that we've done this, we've seen some progress in the building of those relationships between the regulators and the industry that was maybe not having as frequent conversations as they should have, and that then also repairs relationships and potentially smoothens the way for these digital financial services to thrive.
Thank you, Brian. And what are some of the arguments you use to bring parties to speak to each other? And, when is there, do you aim for a formal dialogue platform, or how does that work in practice?
Well, GSMA obviously has access to both the public sector, the regulators, as well as our members, or the mobile operators, or the mobile money providers. And what we do is basically make a case for why we think that there should be dialogue. Often, the industry, as individual operators, would have relationships with their regulators and would individually, have those conversations with their regulators. But the challenge we see in a lot of the markets we go to is that lack of industry consensus on particular, regulatory points. And what we do is build the consensus within the industry and then deliver that as an industry to the regulator. And the regulators, of course, many of the operators, the regulators we've dealt with, do have open door policies and are willing to listen to structured dialogue brought to them by the industry. And so really what we leverage on is our ability to convene the industry and help them align on their positions and present a common front as an industry, presenting common challenges to the regulator.
Thank you. Another tool that you're using at GSMA is the Mobile Money Regulatory Index. Can you tell us a few words about this index and how or whether it captures some of those political economy issues that we talked about earlier?
Yeah, so the regulatory index is a tool that we've started developing in 2018, and it basically looks at the regulatory frameworks across about 80 countries. We're expanding it to just about 90 countries for 2019. And what we do is look at the key enablers of an enabling regulatory environment, basically the key indicators that would help enable that enabling regulatory environment. And out of this, most of these relate to the actual regulatory text, so it's not so much the political economy issues, but we do have one dimension. So these indicators are grouped in various dimensions, and one of the dimensions is, I think, we touch on the political economy issues. This is a dimension we call the infrastructure and infrastructure development dimension. Now here we look at various issues, like I mentioned, about the payments infrastructure. We look at the ID infrastructure and other areas, other potential elements that would impact the ability of that regulatory framework to be enabling for the mobile money sector. But I should stress that the indexes itself is solely focused on regulatory texts and not so much extraneous factors.
Okay, thank you, Brian. Maybe my last question to you for now is, what would your recommendation be for funders on how they can facilitate regulatory reforms for DFS?
Right. So a lot of what we do is, beyond supporting our mobile money provider members with technical advice, is making advocacy pitches to various stakeholders, the regulators, and even the donor community and others. But I think the role, the very important role that your funders can play would be in influencing policymakers and regulators in some of these countries. I think some of your funders have very close proximity and access to high levels of government in many of these countries, and that could actually be used, or that could be leveraged to deliver some of these advocacy messages, especially where there's alignment. Looking at CGAP's work, looking at UNCDF's work. I think that those kind of relationships between your funders and these governments or policymakers and regulators could actually be leveraged in bringing about change, or at least showing that there is industry and other stakeholder alignment on some of these critical issues.
Thank you very much, Brian. I think that was a very clear message. And let me just remind all participants to ask questions through the chat box. And we already got a few questions, so I think I will jump directly to those. So there was one concrete question for UNCDF and whether, now there are a lot of questions coming in, whether you do work on financial services for refugees in certain countries. And maybe let me combine that with one other question, which was around, you know, the notion of policy accelerations. And I would love to know from you, Ahmed, whether, you know, faster is always better.
Thanks, Barbara. Let me answer the refugee one first because it's easier. Sure. And then we can get into the other one. We do work, we have worked, and we continue to access to DFS for refugees. We will be working in Ethiopia this year. We've done a lot of great work in Uganda and Zambia, primarily in those markets. Actually, those are the three where we have demonstrable programs that have focused explicitly on refugees. In many markets, we've talked about the role that tiered KYC can play in providing access to internally displaced people as well as those crossing borders. So yes is the answer. If there's more information needed, particularly on the Uganda and Zambia pieces of work, happy to talk about that. We've also got a great collaboration with UNHCR where they've leveraged our methodology and our thinking into many of the markets where they work on that sort of stuff, including WFP, although that's starting to verge a little bit away from refugees alone, but also sort of other development issues. And on the I hope that answers the question. On the acceleration issue, I 100% agree that faster is not necessarily better. But I think it's really a relative question. And the acceleration is relative to what would happen if we did nothing. How long would it take? I think most people on this webinar would agree that if we did nothing and we just let time manage itself, it wouldn't be fast enough. And our focus is not only in terms of the SDGs and having a very clear time frame, 10 more years effectively, to achieve some very ambitious goals. We also think that there's no reason why some markets have to wait to pass change. Certain very mechanical things don't exist, like consultation between the industry, for example, in public sector, or availability of capacity building. Like, we would make a decision if we were more comfortable with the context. Well, let me help you with that. Improvements in supervision, right? So there are a lot of things, I think, some simple changes that need to be delicately presented and agreed, but once implemented are not that complicated, that can in themselves accelerate change. I should also highlight that we do not promote unreasonable acceleration. I think we would say if we were to come in and expect change over 2 months, 3 months, that would be completely unreasonable. For example, in Sierra Leone right now, we've earmarked 1 year, 12 months, to help them on a really comprehensive consumer protection policy and supervisory framework. That's still a long time in relative terms, but it would take forever perhaps. Or the changes themselves may not enable DFS. So we might see change, but it might not move the needle in the digital finance context. So it's a relative question, which is why I gave a cagey answer. Hope that answered it.
Thank you, Ahmed. And I think there is another question that is linked to that, which is, you know, whether during the diagnostic process you also look at aspects of enforcement and supervisory issues, and basically the likelihood of whether regulation will be enforced in the way that it was intended, because oftentimes better supervision and enforcement would feed back into improvements of the regulation. So how do you look at that in the diagnostics phase?
That's a brilliant question. And I think that's the ideal circumstance where I feel like the regulator of the future that uses supervision and enforcement as a learning mechanism is a great example of what a public sector learning organization ought to look like. But that's a different question, perhaps one for what should funders really try and think about. How do you build regulatory institutions to be learning organizations? And I think the supervisory enforcement component is a critical one. We have found that oftentimes the hesitancy to pass new reforms is because of the concern of an inability to enforce and an inability to supervise. And we've also seen that, and it comes from an honest place where I've worked on diagnostics myself, where we've reviewed regulations and talked to the industry, walked into server rooms and realized that these regulations are so comprehensive, they're unenforceable. So that nexus between enabling regulations, safe markets, and your supervisory context is a complex one. And I know CGAP's doing great work on the supervisory stuff, and we try and lead the charge by bringing that to bear.
Thank you, Ahmed. So I see there is some discussion going on in the chat box, and you're already making links to with other colleagues to continue the discussion. So that's great, because that's one of the objectives of this webinar, is to connect people to dig deeper on these issues, which we are just scratching the surface of. So let me maybe see whether there is one other question that we would like to address here. So there is one question from Elise on whether you could share examples of what to do when you just see that regulators, for example, the Central Bank and the Ministry of Finance and the Telecoms Supervision Agency are not talking together or don't have the same vision. How do you get to the next step? This could be also, Brian, if you have your perspective to share, that would also be interesting. So we give Ahmed a break.
Let me go while Brian thinks about it. Sorry, Brian, you ready? Go for it.
Sorry, I was just going to say that as private sector, it's not always easy to try and prompt the regulators to stick with the government, with the minister, for instance, or the Ministry of Finance. So a lot of our engagement as industry is really restricted to engagements with the regulator. For the most part, the regulators are on top of the policy issues affecting the digital financial services space, but granted, there are some intersections with the Ministries of Finance. So I think that's probably a question perhaps better for Ahmed to respond to.
Okay.
Yeah,
piece
sure.
of advice from you.
I think it's a great question. The one way is capacity building, where first of all, perhaps to understand the reason why there might be a disconnect or lack of shared vision. It could be simply about just seeing the problem differently. And we feel like whether it's in-person training or providing scholarships to online training, et cetera, peer exchanges where we visit other markets and making that open to the Ministry of Finance is one way to help all the actors see the problem the same way. The other way is, I mentioned in my talk before about, the sort of contextual enablers, and many times in most markets we work in, the Ministry of Finance has actually put out public policy objectives that align perfectly with what the central bank intends to achieve through regulatory reform. And the debate and the arguments often is in the devil is in the details in terms of precision, language, for example, or just a sort of misinterpretation of what that outcome is. And rather than convene necessarily, we try and have bilateral discussions to sort of understand respectively where they stand, and then come back to our convening power and basically make the case to say that you're both on the same side of the table looking at the problem rather than negotiating against each other.
Well, thank you very much, Ahmed, Brian, and Patrick, and thank you to all attendees for joining the discussion today. I think it's a really timely discussion and an important